The Albanese government has pulled the plug on its controversial misinformation and disinformation bill because the opposition, the Greens, the crossbench in the Senate, basically everyone was against it except them. Trade Minister Don Farrell confirmed it was Gonski during an interview with Andrew Clennell this morning.
The opposition in a former iteration said that they wanted that legislation. The Greens said that they wanted to support that legislation. They've joined forces now to stop the legislation. Unfortunately, that's the end of it. There will be no legislation, the misinformation, disinformation, there will be no legislation.
Oh, boo-hoo, they won't let us do what we want to do. Given that Don Farrell is standing in front of Vines there, you might say he was having a bit of a whine. But I find this a little curious because give me credit.
That was terrible, but yes.
I'll take it. But I find this a little curious because I thought, or at least Albo and Michelle Rowland and the rest of them told us, that the mis and disinformation bill was vital, that there was no time to waste, that it would change the social fabric of the nation. And yet they're now happy to walk away from it. This was Communications Minister Michelle Rowland on September 12. She said misinformation and disinformation pose a serious threat to the safety and well-being of Australians, as well as to our democracy, society and economy. Doing nothing and allowing this problem to fester is not an option. Doing nothing is not an option. But we've dropped the bill to fix it. On September 16, she wrote, research shows a growing number of Australians, 80% according to a 2024 survey by the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, are concerned and want action. So there should be broad support for this bill, you would think. She went on, addressing the surge of harmful misinformation and disinformation is a significant issue for governments and society worldwide. It must be reckoned with because if left unchecked, it will undermine our way of life as we know it. But now she's dropped the bill, so I suppose our way of life as we know it is about to be undermined. I mean, surely, if this was as important as you said it was, you would fight this tooth and nail, but they've fallen at the first hurdle, Caroline.
Of course, and the thing is, it's one thing to talk about, you know, agreeing with something in principle. It is very, very different when you start putting it together, defining things, seeing how it's going to be implemented, and more often than not in government, there's a problem that's this big and government comes across with a solution that is this big but only actually solves half the problem and creates all these other problems as well. And I knew it was in big trouble when this massive big government overreach was poo-pooed by David Pocock. Who loves massive government involvement. I was like, it's done, it's gone, it's all over.
We're in big trouble.
He's the most sensible teal.
You are you're on the blower to Albo all the time.
Never.
What's happened here?
He wanted this to die for weeks. It was
He
very,
wanted
very
it to die?
Yes, absolutely. It was very, very
You
clear.
shouldn't have done it in the first place.
That's right. It shouldn't have been there in the first place. But again, as Cara says, you ask someone, do you support misinformation, disinformation? Everyone's going to go, of course not, absolutely not. But then when you actually have to specify what that misinformation is, suddenly they're very different. So misinformation that, you know, say, for example, COVID lockdowns are necessary or that schools have to be shut to prevent the spread of the disease, things that we now know were absolute bonkers, but which was an absolute consensus among governments at the time. And, you know, you can go down the vaccine rabbit hole as well, you know, that there's no way that any of these vaccines could possibly ever cause any harm. And that is, I think, where the sort of genesis of this thinking came from, that this was vital to prevent people from doing things that were going to kill them or cause harm. But again, none of these things are black and white. And as soon as you actually start trying to define what misinformation is, well, who watches the detectives? Who decides what misinformation is? Is it?
Yeah, who's the arbiter?
Is it the
That's actually the terrifying
right. Is it a Labor government or is it when the coalition gets in a coalition government? And again, once a government decides what is legitimate information and what isn't, you're basically getting into state-run media. And so I think there was probably the best of intentions, but it became very, very clear, not least when a lot of what the government was saying about this bill itself got fact-checked and labelled misinformation. They realised that they just opened this huge Pandora's box, which, you know, and so suddenly the cure was just far, far worse than the disease.